which is a statement by Rosanna Cunningham on greenhouse gas emission statistics for 2018. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question at the end of the statement to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The most recent greenhouse gas emissions statistics for Scotland were published this morning. These statistics are historic and apply to the period up to the end of 2018 only. They therefore predate the First Minister's declaration in 2019 of a global climate emergency and the substantial work undertaken by this government since then to combat climate change. Reporting to Parliament is an annual requirement under Scotland's climate change legislation. However, this year's statement occurs in circumstances that could not have been predicted. Our immediate focus, of course, must continue to be responding to the public health crisis of COVID-19 and on protecting lives and livelihoods. But the climate crisis has not gone away. It remains the greatest long-term challenge facing humanity. Unchecked, climate change has the potential to cause significant and irreversible social and economic damage, both here in Scotland and globally. And that is why the Scottish Government's response to the global climate emergency continues in earnest. We remain absolutely committed to ending Scotland's emissions contribution by 2045, with a 75% reduction being achieved by 2030. COVID-19 means that our starting position has most definitely changed, but our ambitions have not, and we are committed to delivering a green recovery from this pandemic. Today's statistics are the first to be reported under new, more transparent arrangements which this government introduced through last year's Climate Change Act in accordance with recommendations from the Committee on Climate Change. On this new reporting basis, emissions in 2018 were down by 50% since the 1990 baseline, exactly half of the way to net zero. This strong long-term progress means that Scotland continues to lead the UK as a whole and to rank second only to Sweden amongst our Western European neighbours. However, the annual target to reduce emissions by 54% has been missed. This outcome is certainly disappointing, but we should not lose sight of two things. Firstly, Scotland's annual targets, shaped and agreed across this chamber as they were, have intentionally been set to provide an extremely stretching pathway to net zero. And such a world-leading pathway will inevitably face challenges, but by being ambitious and by stretching ourselves in pursuit of net zero, we will go a long way to reaching our destination. Today's statistics do highlight one such setback, with changes to the national energy mix and freezing temperatures from the beast from the east during the early months of 2018, contributing to a rise in emissions from energy supply and heating used for buildings. To set that in context, while emissions reductions were seen in all other sectors, including transport, industry and agriculture, during 2018 the overall effect was a 1.5% increase, and we expect a substantial part of that was driven by the cold weather. Secondly, many other developed countries are experiencing a similar journey towards net zero as Scotland. We are now in a transition period where changes across the whole of society will be essential to achieving future reductions. And as I've said, we must remember that these statistics are always 2 years after the event and so do not capture many recent Scottish Government actions. The actions not yet being picked up include most aspects of our 2018 climate change plan, which rises to the shared international whole society challenges that I've referred to. It also misses all of the measures announced following the First Minister's declaration of a global climate emergency in 2019. And to give just a few examples of specific work not yet captured in these statistics, the development of an ambitious deposit return scheme, further increasing our tree planting ambition, announcing last year increased funding for the restoration of our vital peatlands, increasing the budget for Energy Efficient Scotland this year to over £150 million across a range of domestic programmes, making available an extra £2 billion of infrastructure investment over the next parliamentary term for measures to support climate change, and ensuring that the Scottish National Investment Bank has the transition to net zero as one of its primary missions. This recent acceleration in action reflects our recognition of the scale of the challenge represented by Scotland's world-leading targets and the need for a national effort to meet these. However, Presiding Officer, the nature of the challenge faced by Scotland and other countries has also now been fundamentally altered by the lasting impacts of COVID, particularly to our economies. The foundation from which we will now journey towards net zero has changed. In recognition of this, the Scottish Government is developing a green recovery and reflecting carefully on last month's advice from the Committee on Climate Change. We have welcomed the Committee's 6 key principles to rebuild whilst delivering a stronger, cleaner and more resilient economy. This will include a revised version of the 2018 Climate Change Plan. I hope to lay this in Parliament in December to align with the Scottish Budget if possible. This recast plan will set out a credible pathway as part of a green recovery to meeting Scotland's world-leading climate targets over the period to 2032. It will also set out plans to reduce emissions further to make up for the shortfall from the missed annual targets for 2018 and 2017. And I am continuing to chair a Sustainable Renewal Advisory Group to help shape the recasting of the plan and to work towards a green economic recovery. In addition to the principles from the Committee on Climate Change, we're awaiting further expert advice on shaping the recovery from Scotland's Just Transition Commission and the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery. This strong collective platform of expert advice will guide our approach to sustainable economic recovery. We're also looking to learn lessons from the changes to people's lives during the pandemic. We know there is support for a green recovery, and we are committed to supporting people to embed new behaviours which reduce emissions and benefit both our environment and health. And we're already taking action. In April, we announced a £10 million fund for Scottish pop-up cycle lanes and wider pavements to support active travel during lockdown. In May, the fund was tripled to £30 million. Last week saw the launch of ScotWind, the first offshore wind leasing round to be administered in Scotland. This is a significant milestone, both for Crown Estate Scotland and for our climate change ambitions. We've also launched the Energy Transition Fund, a £62 million package of support for recovery and a just transition through growth in markets such as hydrogen and carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Tomorrow, the Energy Minister will set out plans for low-carbon infrastructure funding as part of the phased delivery of the heat transition deal to support recovery in the energy efficiency, heat and low-carbon energy sectors and to accelerate the much-needed investment in heat decarbonisation projects. Of course, Scotland's ability to deliver a green recovery and meet our emissions reduction targets is also dependent to a very significant extent on UK government action, a matter referred to also by the Committee on Climate Change. Substantial responsibilities and regulatory controls that could assist in our objectives are retained by the UK government, including parts of the fiscal system, decarbonisation of the gas and electricity grid, development of hydrogen capacity and further investment in carbon capture and storage. I have recently written to the UK government to call on them to take the action that currently only they can in these vital areas. Finally, just as global cooperation is crucial in the fight against COVID-19, it is also crucial in the fight against climate change. COP26 will be in Glasgow in 2021. We look to other countries to follow our lead and come forward with strategies to reach net zero emissions and deliver a green recovery. We will share our experiences, but also learn from others. COP26 must build on green recovery plans and help set the world on course to net zero in a way that is fair and just. Presiding Officer, we are committed to such a green, just and resilient recovery for Scotland, one that places us firmly on the pathway to net zero emissions by 2045 at the latest. Both COVID-19 and climate change present global challenges of unparalleled scale, and Scotland is making progress in tackling both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We'll move to questions now. First from Annie Wells, to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Annie Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd just like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement. This SNP government are very good at setting ambitious targets, but meeting them is a whole different story. Not only did we miss the target by 4%, we're actually going in the wrong direction. Source emissions are up. And the Cabinet Secretary's statement today blames the cold weather for this increase. Does the Cabinet Secretary really believe the cold weather is a good excuse in Scotland? Cold weather is something we are all aware of when we set these targets. The Cabinet Secretary also talks a good game about what this government have done in recent years. But the SNP have been in power for more than a decade. This missed target is their failure. How will this government make up the lost ground? We need a clear roadmap, not just promises. We saw a lot of headlines a few years ago about Nicola Sturgeon's energy company. Where is it? And finally, during this pandemic, what is the government doing to help people continue to recycle more?
Cabinet Secretary.
I know that Annie Wells is relatively new to this role, so I will be as kind as possible. Could I remind Annie Wells that Scotland continues to outperform the UK as a whole in reducing long-term emissions, and in Western Europe is second only to Sweden. Targets have been intentionally set to provide an extremely stretching pathway. If we did not set stretching targets, we would be accused of making things too easy for ourselves. Instead, this country, Scotland, has one of the most constrained legislative ways of dealing with climate change of any country in the world. We are the only country in the world that sets these annual targets for ourselves. There will always be hiccups on the way. And yes, of course, we do have to take into account Scotland's weather. But I think even Annie Wells has got to acknowledge that occasionally our winters are even more severe than at other times. And the beast from the east was one of those years.
Claudia Beamish to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of the statement. It is indeed immensely disappointing that the 2018 target has not been met. At worst, sectoral changes showed inexcusable emissions increases, and at best, measly reductions of a few percentage points. If we are to meet the interim 2030 target of 75%, which is so vital in terms of keeping below 1.5 degrees, we need robust and urgent action now. There are indisputable connections between the climate and nature emergencies, and we must address them together for the sake of people and planet. The failures of the years focused on in this report only strengthen the need for transformational change and bold governance now. Saying this, will the Cabinet Secretary act to extend the life of the Just Transition Commission to help embed equality at the heart of the path to net zero? And will she guarantee to work with all portfolios to ensure the updated climate change plan reflects this urgency? Because the UK Committee on Climate Change letter to the Cabinet Secretary, as she points out in her statement, highlights a number of actions we can take to bring the new skilled jobs across Scotland that we need, urban and rural. And the recent STUC report reinforces the opportunities we can take together as we come out of the COVID crisis. This, of course, includes action for a publicly owned energy company. Will the Cabinet Secretary give an update on progress towards this today, please? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, that was quite long. I'll try to be as quick as possible. I think Claudia Beamish knows that the energy company is not something that sits in my portfolio, and I will refer the comments on that to the relevant portfolio. The Just Transition Commission has already been tasked with looking at the economic recovery scenario that we are immediately dealing with. That's something that I've already done, and they're working hard on that already. And while I haven't taken any formal decision about extending the life of the Just Transition Commission, I wouldn't want to say that that was not going to happen, and I will need to consider that. On the issue of working with all portfolios, I think Claudia Beamish knows that that is happening anyway. There is a deal of very serious work being undertaken across all of the portfolios in this government. All are challenged by this, all are trying to do this as well as deal with COVID, and that will continue to be what we try to instill right across the board as we move out of the emergency, the economic emergency that has been is something that we have to confront at the moment. So that cross-portfolio work almost goes without saying, and I speak regularly with my colleagues on these matters.
Mark Ruskell to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Today's statistics are final evidence that the Scottish Government has failed to have any positive impact whatsoever on transport emissions. You get what you pay for. In Ireland, 20% of the transport budget will now go to walking and cycling, while 2/3 of the rest will go to public transport, thanks to the Irish Greens. So does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the experience of the COVID lockdown shows us that people want change, they want those green transport choices, and that the billions of pounds the government is spending on road expansion should be redirected to cycling, walking and public transport to give everybody those real transport choices?
Cabinet Secretary. I don't think 1 year's reporting on what is an annual reporting issue is final evidence of anything. Somebody will be standing here next June giving a statement next year on these statistics. And there's an enormous amount of work being done, as Mark Ruskell knows. He also must surely be aware that transport is one of the areas in which there are major challenges as a result of what has happened in terms of COVID. There are certainly strong moves, as I highlighted in the statement, towards walking and cycling, and we very much hope that we can embed those behaviours. Personally, and I would have expected Mark Ruskell also to acknowledge this, there may now be some more significant challenges in a return to mass transportation. And those are some of the issues that we will have to grapple with as we analyse the results of this on people's behaviour.
Ruth Maguire to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Presiding Officer, we have many natural assets here which can help contribute to our emissions reduction target and support economic recovery and jobs. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline recent developments where Scotland's natural assets are being used in innovative ways as part of this?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, our natural assets will of course be central to our national journey to net zero emissions, and I think there was a reference made in Claudia Beamish's question along those lines as well. The recent launch of Scotland, which I've spoken about, reflects our seas hosting some of the best offshore wind resources in the world. The North Sea oil and gas sector can also play a positive role in Scotland's energy transition, helping to design the diverse energy system we need for the future. And I do welcome the report today from Oil and Gas UK, committing to halving operational emissions over the next decade. That report is timely, following on from our announcement last Friday of £62 million to support the energy transition. And finally, I could not let this opportunity go past not to mention the ambitious programme of nature-based solutions, including action for restoring Scotland's vital peatlands, which is one of the things which I am most excited about.
Liam MacArthur to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and again I thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of her statement. But the fact Scotland has missed its climate change targets again is seriously damaging. The rhetoric and promises have certainly been world-leading, the delivery of change not so much. Given that the work, quote, not yet captured by these statistics, includes DRS, National Investment Bank and other promises that still are only in the pipeline, doesn't this mean, regrettably, we are looking at more annual targets being missed in the future?
Cabinet Secretary.
And speak for the future. I can only speak for the statistics that I have in front of me. I spoke about a potential minister next year standing here dealing with the 2019 statistics. I rather suspect that the minister standing here in 2022 dealing with the 2020 statistics will have a very different story to tell for very different reasons, and that is one of the issues that we have to deal with. The fact is that from year to year we have to cope with sometimes quite unpredictable scenarios. You know, there are quite a lot of things that are now in play. I can't wave a magic wand. I can't say that a deposit return system, having gone through Parliament, can be instituted overnight. We all know that that is not possible, but we also all know that that will contribute to the longer-term emissions reductions. And that's what this Parliament has to keep doing.
Joe McAlpine to be followed by Finlay Carson.
Thank you. In many important ways, Scotland's ability to make progress in emissions reductions is linked to UK Government action. Can the Cabinet Secretary say more on the impact of UK actions and share details of communications with the UK Government on this matter? Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it is the case, of course, as the Committee on Climate Change notes in almost every one of its reports, the ability of Scotland to deliver a green recovery here is also dependent on UK Government action. And there are substantial responsibilities and regulatory controls that do remain reserved. In particular, to progress in Scotland, urgent action is required in terms of parts of the fiscal system, decarbonisation of the gas and electricity grid, the development of hydrogen capacity, and the further investment in carbon capture and storage. There are also key areas where action from the UK Government is essential to help capture the opportunities from the transition, such as in heat decarbonisation, industrial decarbonisation, zero-emission vehicles and green finance. I have written to the UK Government on a number of occasions in this regard, most recently at the start of this month. And I need to remind everybody that the target of net zero by 2045 was set by the Committee on Climate Change, or suggested by the Committee on Climate Change for Scotland, at the same time as they were suggesting 2050 for the UK as a whole. Well, the UK as a whole will not reach 2050 if Scotland does not reach 2045. And we will not reach 2045 if the UK Government does not commit itself to getting to 2050 and show that they are willing to take the action to do that.
Nick Carson to be followed by David Torrance.
This government has failed and will fail to deliver R100 on time. It's failed to deliver on its commitment on DRS and the timescale it suggested. This government's good at making big announcements, but appalling at delivering. The government likes to tell the world how ambitious they are, but when it comes to hugely important issues such as this, they simply don't have the policies to deliver. Unlike the air that many people are forced to breathe, the result of this government's decade of failed policies to improve air quality are clear. Domestic emissions rising by 1.5% between 2017 and 2018, emissions from energy supply increasing, and transport, still Scotland's highest emitting sector, saw emissions fall by only 4.9%. Cabinet Secretary, under requirements in the Climate Change Act, where a target has not been met, the Scottish Government must now lay a report setting out proposals and policies to compensate in future years for the excess emissions. Will that report be delivered on time? And why should we have any faith that the policies contained in it will actually deliver?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm really interested in the fact that Finlay Carson was so opposed to the delay in the introduction of the deposit return system. I suspect that many of the companies and organisations that he normally wants to speak for will be somewhat astonished at that. You know, we have to deal with reality in government. We have to make sure that what we are doing is actually doable. That is important. And yes, we do have to report on the 2017-18 missed targets, and that will be done as part of the work that is being progressed for December and will be laid before Parliament as part of that recast climate change plan update.
David Torrance to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would the Cabinet Secretary agree that hydrogen has an important role to play in reducing Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions? And can the Cabinet Secretary outline what support the Scottish Government is giving to Scottish universities for research and development of hydrogen as an alternative source of energy?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think I've mentioned hydrogen a couple of times already this afternoon. It does have the potential to play a very important part in a low-carbon future and assist in the comprehensive decarbonisation of the Scottish heat, industrial and transport systems. We've appointed consultants to undertake a Scottish hydrogen assessment. The work of the assessment is well underway, and as committed in the programme for government for 2021, the findings of the hydrogen assessment work and other studies will help inform the development and delivery of a Scottish Government action plan for hydrogen and a hydrogen policy statement.
Sarah Boyack, to be followed by John Mason.
Given the huge impact of the pandemic, what is the Scottish Government doing now to accelerate investment programmes which reduce CO2 emissions, such as increased energy efficiency in community-owned renewable heat networks to tackle fuel poverty in our homes and create Scottish jobs, including manufacturing jobs, from the offshore wind projects mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there's a lot of work being done right now. I raised some of those things in my statement, some of the money that has been allocated, particularly in the transport area. We're doing a lot more, and I think that I don't want to step on what might be further announcements. I don't want to pre-announce what I shouldn't be pre-announcing from portfolio areas that are not my own portfolio area. We will and intend to do as much as we possibly can. Amongst other things, I think Sarah Boyack ought to at least acknowledge the £2 billion that has been committed for the lifetime of Parliament to invest in low-carbon infrastructure. So there's an enormous amount of both money and resources being committed to this, and will continue to be so. And it has to be, because that's the only way we're going to achieve our targets.
John Mason, to be followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you very much. There appear to have been some environmental benefits from the COVID-19 crisis, like cleaner air in Hope Street in Glasgow. But are there also challenges that the Secretary sees going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, we're currently trying to understand the actual impacts on emissions reduction in Scotland. John Mason mentions one positive that has come out of it, and obviously the increase in cycling and walking is another positive. But you know, there are still some other issues that aren't so positive. I mean, the planned activity on nature-based solutions and other work that would have happened over these months this year has been restricted because of the physical distance requirements. No doubt there are people in this chamber that will poo-poo that as a reason. But the reality is it does have an impact when that happens. There are also other challenges, including, as I've mentioned already, some people having concerns about the use of public transport in the current situation. So we have to work to better understand these impacts, to learn from the crisis, and to take that learning forward while we build that greener, fairer, healthier future.
Maurice Golden will be followed by Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary know, and can this be shared with the Chamber, by what percentage the deposit return scheme will reduce overall emissions by 2025?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, I can't remember that. I'll make sure I get that information to Maurice Golden.
Angus MacDonald will be followed by Colin Smith.
Thanks, President Officer. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's earlier responses to questions regarding the Government's engagement with groups such as the CCC and the Just Transition Commission. It's clear to all of us there needs to be industrial decarbonisation on a large scale and a global shift to clean growth by driving the technologies, services and markets to produce low-carbon industrial products. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what discussions the Government's had with the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, or IDRIC, based at Heriot-Watt, with a view to moving clean growth forward at a pace?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there are constant engagements along the lines that Angus MacDonald has asked about. These things are part and parcel of the work that we do. I've also, as a matter of fact, raised industrial decarbonisation with my counterparts in the UK government, because as part of the discussion about the setting up of an emissions trading scheme, I have pressed very strongly that the money that flows through that should be very much dedicated to industrial decarbonisation, and that's a commitment I want the UK government to make.
Colin Smith.
Presiding Officer, transport remains Scotland's biggest emitter, falling 10 times slower than the overall reduction in emissions since 1990. We will need transformative policies to get people back onto public transport when it's safer to do so. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if the Government is still committed to delivering free bus travel for under-19s by January, and will the Government consider extending that for all under-26s?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I understand it, the commitment is still there. There may be some delay, but that is still a commitment. I mean, we're trying to analyse the impact of COVID, but we're not withdrawing from that commitment at all.
Thank you very much. And that concludes this item of business. We're going to move on to the next item shortly. Can I just remind members to observe social distancing when entering and leaving the chamber and moving throughout the building. Thank you.